Senator David Vitter, Republican from Louisiana and the ranking member on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. Thanks very much for being with us here on Newsmakers.
Thanks for the invite. Great to be here.
And joining us here with the questioning is David Drucker, who's with the Washington Examiner, senior congressional correspondent, and Coral Davenport, now with the New York Times, covering energy and environmental issues. Thank you for being with us. Let me begin with some news that was made this past week of John Podesta moving back to the White House. And the headline from the Washington Post is that he may urge the Obama administration to bypass Congress on a number of environmental issues. What are you hearing?
Well, my reaction to that is I think that's old news, not new news. I don't think that's a headline because that's been what has been going on for several years, essentially since the 2010 congressional election. I think that has been their whole strategy on environmental policy and a bunch of other things since Republicans took the House in 2010. It's a little hard for me to imagine how they can double down on that. I think they're there already. But certainly I can imagine Podesta continuing to aggressively carry out that strategy.
So if that is the case, what's your biggest concern?
It is what it is now, which is that the Obama administration in many cases in environmental action and others is going beyond its constitutional authority, going beyond their role in terms of executive action. And I think that should be a very broad-based concern, whether you agree or disagree with what they're doing, just in terms of governance and constitutional democracy.
So what's your role, what's the Senate role to stop that if you're opposed to it?
Well, I mean, we're trying to use all the tools that are available as the minority in the Senate to push back on that when we think they're crossing that line. A president has a lot of powers. He has the power to make proper executive orders, to take certain executive action. Nobody's debating that, but there are limits to that, and I think he's gone beyond that in many, many cases. The unconstitutional recess appointments are one clear example, I think, that's being litigated. Our side has essentially won so far, but that'll go to the U.S. Supreme Court. So when we think the president is exceeding his constitutional power, we push back on that in any way we can. On the Environment and Public Works Committee, where I'm very involved, that obviously focuses on EPA regulatory action. I think there are a lot of instances where this is happening with the EPA going beyond its executive authority, and we try to push back on that through oversight and other means.
We'll follow up on that with Coral Davenport.
Sure. Senator, in September, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change produced a report saying that scientists have concluded with 95% certainty that human activities, specifically the burning of fossil fuels, are driving the warming of the planet, leading to rising sea levels, increased drought, sort of a future of extreme and dangerous weather. Do you concur with this? Where do you stand on the science of human-caused global warming?
For a couple of things. First of all, that's not as clear to me at all, particularly given trends in the last 10 years, which have essentially abated in terms of the trends that were being seen before that. Secondly, even if you agree with that, the question is, what are we going to do about it? How do we have impacts? And I'm very, very concerned about taking dramatic action that will clearly have a big negative impact on our economy if it's not going to make a difference with regard to a worldwide issue. If basically China and Russia and India don't follow suit, and there is no sign in sight that they're going to follow suit anytime soon. So I have different levels of concern, and those are the two biggest levels.
I interviewed the Louisiana state climatologist, Barry Keim, earlier this year, and this is what he told me. He said Louisiana might just be the most vulnerable state in the country in terms of climate change. He said in particular that has to do with the impact of sea level rise. The higher the sea level rises, the more vulnerable a coastal state like Louisiana is
Sure.
to damages from increasing storm surge. He said relative sea level rise is off the charts here compared to anywhere else. What's your response to this?
Well, we have a huge problem with coastal erosion and all of the issues that you're talking about. That's a big problem whether climate's a factor or not. And we've been doing a lot to counter that problem and have actually been making progress. So that's a problem, period. Right now, Louisiana is losing about a football field of coastal area. If you can sort of imagine a football field in your mind, every 38 minutes. And that's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, no time off for weekends or holidays. So that's an issue. Whether climate is a factor, climate has not been a dominant factor in that so far. There are arguments that it would be in the future, but I think the science, the established science is that so far that's mostly an impact of things like leveeing the Mississippi River, pushing out what used to be the natural process of building delta by the Mississippi River overflowing its banks every spring, and also the channelization of our coast, which has led to the infusion of salt water into the coast and the marsh, which sort of kills vegetation, which is the glue that holds it together. So I think those have been the dominant causes to date.
But in terms of what, the Louisiana state climatologist himself was taking that into account. He said specifically in terms of climate change, Louisiana is the state most vulnerable to damages. Does that concern you? Do you agree with that?
Yes, it concerns me, and this is an issue no matter what, and that issue concerns me, and we've been doing a lot of things to counteract it.
David Drucker, the Washington Examiner.
I wanted to switch gears for a moment and talk about the Affordable Care Act and its implementation. You've been very active in trying to pass an amendment, which we've all called in Washington the Vitter Amendment, but it would codify in very hard terms what the law had said about members of Congress and their staff accepting government subsidized health care. And also that members and staff, all staff, go into an exchange, an Obamacare exchange. Have you, given where the Office of Personnel Management, federal government's Human Relations Office has come down on this and the regulations they've set out, are you finished trying to get the Senate to pass the Vitter Amendment and try and get this through the House again? It passed once. Or is this something you're going to continue to push where legislation and amendments allow?
Well, I'm absolutely going to continue to push because we haven't had a vote yet in the Senate. So I'm certainly not going to give up when we haven't had a vote, and we'll get a vote in 2014 because I'm going to use every tool available to get that vote.
Do you feel that your Republican colleagues are as committed as you are to trying to get this vote? I mean, we know that
some are, some aren't. Some are gritting their teeth and swearing off camera. And you know what? Virtually all of those will vote with me when we get a vote.
Why did you decide to hone in on this? There's obviously a lot of problems that Republicans feel exist with the Affordable Care Act. This is something that has sort of become a pet project of yours. Why was it this in particular?
Two reasons, really. First of all, it's so egregious. I think the actual statutory language in Obamacare is clear, and I think it's very clear that this OPM rule is in significant ways contrary to that statutory language. And so for me it comes down to two things. First, a basic fairness principle. I think the first rule of American democracy should be that any rule that Congress and the White House passes on America, it should have to live with itself. Same way, same extent, same rule, no special bailout or exemption or subsidy. So that's a core principle. And I think the American people feel this way. I think their top frustration, and they would use, most of them would use a stronger word, but the top frustration with Washington is Washington thinking it's some elite ruling class that gets to live by a different set of rules. So that's number one. Number two is a very practical reason, which also goes to repealing or fixing Obamacare. And that is the quicker Washington has to live with everything it passes on America, the quicker Washington will start getting things right. The quicker it'll feel and understand everything that's wrong with Obamacare and deal with it. So when chefs have to eat their own cooking, usually if the cooking's bad, it improves a lot more quickly that way. So it's a very practical application in terms of dealing with Obamacare.
Do Republicans have a responsibility to offer a replacement to the Affordable Care Act? Because the general consensus is you guys want it repealed, you want it gone.
Sure.
And do you have a responsibility short of that, given where the politics lies in the White House and the Senate, to try and lessen the impact of some of the problems that the law has had on consumers. There's a discussion over whether you guys should just let people live with it and then they can come to you asking for help, or whether as you go along you should try and fix certain things. And in fact, Democrats have accused Republicans of not wanting to fix it in order to allow it to fail. And they say that's one of the problems they're having in fixing the law's issues. What do Republicans need to do? What should they do short of being able to repeal it, which of course you don't have the votes for?
Right. Well, certainly repeal alone isn't good enough. We need significant reform in our healthcare system to fix real problems that exist, like escalating costs. Obamacare has made that worse, but that was a problem before. Like folks with pre-existing conditions. Those are real people who have serious problems getting the coverage they need. We need a focused solution for that. And Republicans have offered targeted solutions to those issues. Now, that's not widely understood in a big way. I don't think we've communicated it clearly enough. I think a lot of the media never wants to report about it, but I think we'll be underscoring that and explaining those targeted solutions more and better in 2014. So we certainly have that responsibility.
Your party's,
I think we...
I just want to follow up because your party's Senate campaign committee already airing ads in your home state aimed at Mary Landrieu.
Yeah.
How big of an issue will this be in 2014?
Oh, I think to take that race as an example, that's at least 80% of that whole campaign in terms of what it's about, what the important issues are to Louisiana folks. And I don't think that's going to be unusual. So it's a huge issue.
Would you like to see her defeated?
Absolutely. She's helping drive the country in the wrong direction, in my opinion, including by helping elect Harry Reid to lead the Senate, including by supporting ultra-liberals who disagree with the mainstream of Louisiana thought, lead in different policy areas, like the chair of my EPW committee, Barbara Boxer.
On legislative issues, though, what's your relationship like with her?
Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde on Louisiana-based non-ideological issues. We work very closely together, hurricane recovery after Hurricane Katrina, on national issues which tend to be much more ideological, like Obamacare. We constantly disagree.
Coral Davenport.
A Louisiana issue, I'm wondering if you could describe how you work with Senator Landrieu on. In 2010, the Gulf Coast was devastated by the BP oil spill. Mm-hmm. But since then, there has been no new law, no new federal action to reform the regulations on the offshore oil industry. Mm-hmm. What should happen in this space? And what are you and Senator Landrieu, do you talk about this?
Well, I guess I disagree with your premise. There hadn't been a big new statute passed. There's been a whole redo of offshore oil and gas regulation. It's a whole new world. I think in some instances it's gone too far and it's added unnecessary burden that does not improve safety. But whatever you think about individual regulations, it's been a complete redo of offshore oil and gas regulation. I would say in general on those sorts of issues, Mary and I agree most of the time.
So you don't think that there needs to be anything further? There doesn't need to be a law further governing offshore drilling or safety?
I don't know exactly what it would be about. There's no statutory change that I think is necessary. I think we can do a whole lot more to be more effective and efficient at exploring and producing energy safely. So I'd love to make changes in that direction. But in terms of protecting public health and safety and making sure a disaster like that doesn't happen again, I don't think we need a statute. I don't know what it would say or do.
Another Louisiana-specific law. Last year, Congress passed a law reforming the National Flood Insurance Program, mm-hmm. Which at the time owed $25 billion to American right. taxpayers. And the general purpose of the law right. Was to take the risk for insuring right. a property in flood-prone areas and take that from the taxpayers and push it onto the private market. Right. You are a number of lawmakers who are looking to change or reform that law. as a free market conservative, can you talk about, doesn't it make more sense to move that liability from the taxpayers to the private market? Why are you pushing back on this? Can you talk about why you want to?
Yeah, first of all, the law didn't privatize flood insurance. It's still a federal program. What it tried to do is price it better so that individual homeowners would assume more of the risk.
Rather than the taxpayer.
Right, rather than the taxpayer. And I'm absolutely for doing that to the greatest extent possible. But when that threatens to literally throw middle-class homeowners out of their home because flood insurance is now unaffordable, when they have followed all the rules up until that point, when they built to the right elevation, they followed the rules, but those rules are changing over time, then I do not think it's right or fair or beneficial to the fiscal soundness of the flood insurance program to have them walk away from their home and their mortgage and turn in the key and exit the program and not pay any premiums. That's really what it's about. So when Biggert-Waters passed over a year ago, I think there was a widespread understanding that it would lead to higher rates, and that was necessary to ensure the solvency of the system. But at the time, nobody, FEMA, private industry, private insurance, nobody said, oh, there are going to be a significant number of cases where those premium increases are outright unaffordable. I mean, literally $25,000, $30,000 a year. That's a whole different story. That doesn't work regarding fairness, and that doesn't work even in terms of the fiscal goal of making the system more sound, because those folks aren't going to be paying those premiums. Those folks are going to be walking away from their homes, and there'll be fewer folks participating in the program.
We have about 7 minutes remaining. Let me turn back to David Drucker.
Let's stick with Louisiana for a second here. Are you planning to run for governor in 2015, and can you talk about your decision-making process in that regard?
Sure. I don't know yet. Wendy and I are going to talk about it and really focus on it over the Christmas holidays. We started to think about it over Thanksgiving, and we're going to continue. And we don't have any hard deadline in mind, but I would expect that we'll come to a conclusion sometime in January. And really, it comes down to one big question, and this may sound simplistic or hokey, but this really is what it's about, is where I think I could make the most positive difference for the remainder of my political life. Because whether I stay in the Senate or if I were to run for governor, that'll be my last political job, elected or appointed, period. So it really comes down to us about where I could make the most significant positive difference.
Why do you say that? Why your last office?
Because I need a retirement plan, and I don't have one yet. So, I mean, I'm not going to stay in elected office forever. And so it's very clear to me that if I stay in the Senate, that'll be my last political job, elected or appointed. And if I were to run and be lucky enough to be elected governor, that would be my last political job, elected or appointed.
And if you were to run for governor, why would you want to serve as governor? What would you want to do?
Because I would have come to the conclusion that I could make the most significant and positive impact there. In terms of what I'd want to do, we have, every state has challenges. We certainly have very important challenges in Louisiana. I'd put education along with some other things at the top of the list, both K through 12 and higher education.
David Drucker.
Have the rules changes in the Senate, which at least for Republicans have been very difficult to stomach, affected your thinking as to where you'd like to spend the next 8 years or so? And do you think about whether or not Republicans will win the majority in 2014 as a part of whether or not you want to stick around in Washington or go home and serve there?
I would say I think about both of those things, but neither are dominant or determining factors. I mean, certainly the recent rules changes make life less pleasant and fulfilling for anybody in the minority. Certainly the prospect of getting in the majority after the next election is exciting, and I think it's a great prospect. I think it's 50-50 or better. But neither of those things are going to be determining factors.
Do you think that the Senate we've seen this past week, where Republicans are forcing Democrats to run out the clock on all of these pieces of legislation and nominations are going to be a price that they have to pay all of next year for the rules change that they pushed through last month?
It's certainly not ending this week or at the end of the year, so it'll certainly continue in some form into 2014. What that looks like and feels like, I think that's completely up to the Democrats.
Coral Davenport.
Senator, as a longtime observer of you and Chairwoman Barbara Boxer on the Environment Committee, I see you sparring with each other frequently. But I think that something a lot of people don't know is that the two of you have actually been working very closely on a major infrastructure bill together.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that? And is that also kind of like a Jekyll and Hyde relationship?
It is. Although I think we're actually making progress on some environment issues too, which is unusual on that committee. But certainly on the infrastructure side, it's been traditional for Republicans and Democrats on the committee to work pretty well together. And I've continued that tradition, and she's continued that tradition. And we came up with a water resources bill a few months ago that I think was a very strong, reform-oriented, bipartisan bill. Actually came out of our committee, and our committee, as you know, is very ideologically divided. I mean, you have some of the strongest conservatives and some of the most liberals. But that water resources bill came out of our committee unanimously, and it passed through the Senate with, I believe, 83 votes, 82 maybe. So whopping majority. And we're in conference now, and it's taken longer than I would like, but I think we're going to get to the finish line early next year with a good conference report. And as soon as that's over, we're going to start on the next highway bill. And I think we'll bring the same bipartisanship to that bill. On the EPA side, it's more unusual for that to ever happen, but it is happening on TSCA reform. Now that doesn't involve Barbara Boxer as much as the lead, but it did involve Frank Lautenberg with the Lautenberg-Vitter bill, and now Tom Udall is filling that position, and we're advancing with a really good TSCA bill, which I think will pass into law in 2014. And also RFS reform. I'm working with Ben Cardin in particular.
This is the
Correct.
ethanol mandate.
Correct. That program is broken. Whether you want to continue it in some form or whether you want to repeal the same thing, I think there's a consensus that there are big problems with the program that threaten to hit the blend wall, to lead to spikes in fuel prices, et cetera. And so I'm working with Ben Cardin, and we hope to have a bipartisan bill in January of 2014 to introduce and start passing.
But a couple of points of surprising bipartisanship on this Environment Committee that we're used to seeing very ideologically divided.
Right.
Let me ask you about Iran, because negotiations continue, yet the threat of sanctions also continues in the Senate.
Right.
Do you trust the Iranian government when it comes to dismantling its nuclear program?
I do not, and I think sanctions are a necessary backdrop if we are to have any chance of success, any reasonable solution that doesn't involve war. And because of that, I'm part of a significant bipartisan group in the Senate that will be introducing and passing, I believe, sanctions legislation in early 2014.
We have a minute or two left. Quick question, David Drecker.
The outgoing Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke announced this past week that he would begin to taper off the quantitative easing. This was a $10 billion minor taper. Wall Street loved it. I wanted to ask you if you felt it should have been stronger, and do you feel that this has artificially juiced the economy? Is it going to cause us a problem when eventually we have to do away with QE, or has it been the right move to help bridge the gap as the economy has sort of sputtered along in a slow recovery?
Well, I've felt for a long time with other conservatives that it was too much for too long, and it's going to lead to problems. You know, time will tell, and I hope it doesn't lead to major problems, but I've had that concern for a long time. Certainly understand that we had a horrible economy, but I think it's more incumbent on Congress and the President to do something in a meaningful way and not essentially get sort of bailed out with this constant monetary policy. So I felt with other conservatives that it is building into our economy some real dangers that may manifest, in the future.
And let me conclude with one political question. If your governor, Bobby Jindal, runs for president in 2016, will you support him?
Oh, Jay, I haven't thought about that. I mean, I like Bobby. I respect his leadership. I agree with all of his political values, but I haven't thought about, what I would do or wouldn't do personally in the 2014 race. I do think he'll run. I think he's been running, and I think he'll be a meaningful and significant candidate.
He wants to be president?
Oh, yeah. I think that's very obvious to everybody who's paying attention.
Senator David Vitter, Republican of Louisiana, thank you very much for being with us here.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.